You have created a monster and it will destroy you.
Patience, patience. I believe in this monster, as you call it. And if you don't, well, you must leave me alone.
New evidence has emerged that J.P. Morgan deliberately orchestrated the sinking of the Titanic in order to form the Federal Reserves. What's up, everybody? Truth Seeker here. In 1889, Morgan Robinson wrote a book entitled Wrecked of the Titan about a luxury liner deemed the unsinkable that was going too fast in the North Atlantic and hit an iceberg, killing almost everybody on board. Anon News reports 14 years later this fictional book would play out in real life exactly down to the name, with the wreck of the Titanic, but this time it would have major political implications. Some of the wealthiest men in the world were on that ship, and some were opposed to the Federal Reserve and central banks. Let's go through some facts about the whole Titanic operation. J.P. Morgan funded and built the Titanic. J.P. Morgan was booked on the voyage but canceled at the last second. A friend of J.P. Morgan, Milton Hersey, also canceled at the last moment and survived to build the Hersey food empire. There were no red flares on board to signal any boats for rescue, only white flares that signal a party and that everything is okay. It was the first ship of its kind with the ability to seal decks electromagnetically, which could also seal people below the deck. The captain, Edward Smith, was one of the most decorated captains of his time and would have been totally out of character by avoiding precautions. The author of the book was poisoned to death a couple of years after the Titanic sank. The Federal Reserve was formed the very next year, and then the Astor family was one of the richest families in the world, and John Astor III opposed the Federal Reserve. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man in the world at the time, a friend of Nikola Tesla, and an outspoken opponent of the creation of the Federal Reserve. Astor gained his wealth in part as a real estate builder, investor, and inventor. Other prominent Federal Reserve detractors such as Benjamin Guggenheim and Isa Strauss also died on board. Did J.P. Morgan get the idea of how to kill off the opposition to the Federal Reserve from a book written 14 years prior? This was a book below titled The Titan, published 14 years before the Titanic sank. And look at the similarities. Did they hatch a plan at Jekyll Island to build a ship to eliminate the competition? Similarities to the Titanic. Although the novel was written before the Olympic-class Titanic had ever been designed, there are some remarkable similarities between the fictional and real-life counterparts. Like the Titanic, the fictional ship sank in April in the North Atlantic, and there were not enough lifeboats for the passengers. There are also similarities between the size 800 feet long for the Titan versus 882 feet and 9 inches long for the Titanic, speed 25 knots for the Titan, 21 knots for the Titanic, and life-saving equipment. Beyond the name, the similarities between the Titanic and the fictional Titan include, described as unsinkable. The Titanic was the world's largest luxury liner, 882 feet, displacing 63,000 long tons, and was once described as being practically unsinkable. The Titanic was the largest craft afloat and the greatest of the works of men, 800 feet, displacing 75,000 tons, and it was considered unsinkable. Shortage of lifeboats. The Titanic carried only 16 lifeboats, plus 4 Engelhard folding lifeboats, less than half the number required for the passenger's capacity of 3,000. The Titan carried as few as the law allowed, 24 lifeboats, less than half needed for her 3,000 capacity. Struck an iceberg. Moving too fast at 22.5 knots, the Titanic struck an iceberg on the starboard side on the night of April 14, 1912, in the North Atlantic, 400 miles away from Newfoundland. Also, on April night, in the North Atlantic, 400 miles from Newfoundland, Terra Nova, the Titan hit an iceberg while traveling at 25 knots, also on the starboard side. Sinking. The unsinkable Titanic sank, and more than half of her 2,200 passengers died. The indestructible Titan also sank, more than half of her 2,500 passengers drowning. Went down bow first. The Titan actually capsized before it sank. There really is a lot of similarities here, and there's no telling at times like this, the things people were able to get away with. There wasn't, satellites, and there wasn't people with smartphones, and there wasn't, too much anything for people to actually communicate to. These people were out in literally the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of the ocean. Anything could have happened to that ship, and all we know is the stories of the people that were supposedly survivors. And pretty much the majority of the people that got off that ship were the wealthy. They all pretended to be poor. There was even guys pretending to be women carrying children. There was just a whole bunch of crazy stuff like that. But these rich people got off that ship, and they made sure that the story that they had stuck. And that's what everybody kept repeating forever. Just like how all the stories happen now with today's false flags. Tragedies that happen. We definitely live in a world where rich elite people can make anything happen, and they can make anybody believe any story that they want to always receive an outcome to their favor. But I think that day in history is finally over. And this now being the digital era, the age of information, where we are all actually linking together and sharing with each other now, and actually starting to wake up and ignore what the mainstream media has to tell everybody. We basically started a whole new revolution. A whole new era is here. And we're going to start busting out all the shadiness that happened throughout history all the way till now. That's our job as alternative media. And that's your guys' job as critical thinkers. It's very serious times that we live in right now. Right now, the decisions that we make and the things that happen are very, very important to our future right now. There's going to be a lot of changes happening in the upcoming years. We're seeing a lot of it actually happen right now, but this is still just the tip of the iceberg. No pun intended there. But we're definitely moving to a more positive direction, I can see. And I am proud that so many people are awake and joining the bandwagon here. So we got a country to save. So it's our jobs and duties to expose all the corruption that happened, even if it was in the past, like this, for example. And to me, I find this very, very, very ironic how the two stories compare so much. It's almost as if whoever reported the story on the Titanic more or less just read that book and then just changed a few details from it. I don't know. You guys be the judge of it. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Jekyll Island is located off the coast of the U.S. state of Georgia and is currently run by a self-sustaining, self-governing body. While it is owned by the state of Georgia since 1947, before that, much of its land was privately owned, beginning in the colonial era, with secretive events that took place on the island during the early 20th century being central to today's episode. At the end of November 1910, some of the most influential men in America gathered on Jekyll Island for a secret meeting. Their names were Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, who was the leader of the Republican Party, Adam P. Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department, Frank Arthur Vanderclip, who was President of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davison, who was also a prominent banker, Benjamin Strong, who was another important banker, and Paul Walberg, who, you guessed it, was another influential banker. The purpose of the secret meeting was to plan the country's monetary policy and establish a central banking system, which resulted in the draft legislation for what eventually became the creation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Of course, there's a gap there from when the meeting took place in 1910 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, which I'll get into. But first, allow me to briefly define what the Federal Reserve is. Although it has the word federal in it, which by definition implies it has something to do with the central government, in reality, it is the name of a group of private banks owned by private citizens such as the Rothschild banking family that prints currency, then loans this paper currency to the United States on interest. So rather than the US government printing its own currency backed by gold or silver, as stated in the US Constitution, this legislation made it so instead the US borrows paper printed by a group of private bankers that collect interest on every dollar printed, backed by nothing. This ability to print and loan money on interest is what financed both world wars, drowning the nation in debt, and why $1 in 1913 is equal to $25 today.
So in effect, we're financing our trade with China, trade with Japan by our Federal Reserve currency, which is neither federal, it's not federal any more than the Federal Express Company is a federal company. And it has no reserves because it doesn't need any reserves because it prints its own currency. If you could print your own money, what do you need of reserves? You just go and warm up the printing press and turn out another $10 billion. So, and finally, it's not a system. It's called the Federal Reserve System. It's not federal, it has no reserves, and it's not a system, but I'm the only person in the world who's ever defined it in my works as a criminal syndicate. And that's what it is. It's a criminal syndicate, just like the mafia, which is one of its subsidiaries, and the CIA and all the criminal syndicates work out of the Federal Reserve System, because that's what a Federal Reserve System is. A central bank is a group of bankers which have total control of a nation's economy, and they print their own money, print as much as they want to, and it eventually becomes worthless. And I defined in my work that a central bank's principal role is for war finance, because war finance is the most profitable enterprise you can get into. And so if you're a banker, you're looking for the best investment you can make, which is a war.
Most intelligent people might think that this system is not only unconstitutional, but is unwise, resembling a Ponzi scheme, and designed to make a small group of bankers extremely wealthy at the expense of the working middle class, which gets stuck with inflation and debt. You might also think that surely there must be some sort of opposition to this financial corruption. What about them? This brings us back to those critical years, between the secret Jekyll Island meeting of 1910 and 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law. To understand what happened to the opposition to the central bankers, we need to take a look at a man named J.P. Morgan, an American financier and banker who dominated corporate finance on Wall Street during the late 1800s, when he was a driving force behind the wave of industrial consolidation in the United States, spearheading the formation of several prominent multinational corporations, including U.S. Steel Corporation and General Electric, with controlling interests in AT&T, Western Union, and 24 railroads. J.P. Morgan funded and built the Titanic, as well as its sister ship called the Olympia. While there is much written on theories involving an insurance scam, where the damaged twin ship Olympia was really the ship that sank, in an effort to collect insurance money on an already partially damaged vessel. I won't be addressing that conspiracy theory at this time, but there are several interesting videos by others available online for those interested. Instead, I'd like to focus on the fact that J.P. Morgan was booked on the maiden voyage but canceled the day before. The same fortunate outcome cannot be said for the most wealthy and influential opponents to the creation of the Federal Reserve Act, American millionaires who did not owe their fortunes to banking, such as Jacob Astor, one of the richest people in the world at the time, whose wealth in today's money was the equivalent of $2.25 billion, whose fortune was built in real estate, inheritance from fur trading, and as an inventor, incidentally a friend of Nikola Tesla, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the Spanish-American War. Another opponent to the Federal Reserve Act on board was Benjamin Guggenheim, son of a wealthy miner, who again was not a banker, and either was Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's department store, who, like the other successful non-banker businessman I just named, seemed too unlucky or too unable to seem to make it aboard a life raft, and instead died going down with the ship. It's interesting to note that there were no red flares on board to signal any boats for rescue, only white flares that signal a party or that everything's okay. Yet these wealthy and politically influential men opposed to the Federal Reserve were invited aboard the Titanic for its maiden voyage, the same trip that J.P. Morgan conveniently decided to back out from at the last minute, with no Rockefellers and no Rothschilds on board. All major opposition perishing aboard the ship in 1912, with the Federal Reserve Act established the following year during the holiday season, passed through Congress when most were not even present.
Paul Warburg himself, who was the author of the act, and the other bankers had to, for the first time in their life, come down to Washington and lobby in the halls of Congress to get the Federal Reserve Act passed. And of course, they had to make a lot of promises, a lot of commitments, a lot of bribes. But since they printed the money, it didn't matter. So they bribed the Congress to enact the Federal Reserve Act, which was signed, but they still could not get a majority vote. So they had to wait till the Christmas vacation after Lindbergh and the Middle Western and Western congressmen had departed for Christmas vacation, then they brought the Federal Reserve Act before Congress on December 23rd, after the opposition had left. But they still had a quorum, they still could pass it. And so even the New York Times said, never has legislation of such importance been passed under such circumstances. In other words, the whole Federal Reserve Act was passed through fraud, was passed more or less while Congress was in Christmas vacation. And so Wilson signed the act into law on December 23rd, practically Christmas Eve, and it became public law. So now that they had a central bank with the power to print all the money they wanted, a privately owned bank, and the Federal Reserve Act itself is an amazing act. It's an act of total monopoly because every word in it, first of all the money that the bankers can print becomes an obligation of the U.S. government, which means the U.S. taxpayer. Second, the stockholders of this private bank included in the legislation that no Federal Reserve Bank stock could ever be bought or sold on any exchange in the world. So in other words, the initial purchasers would own it in perpetuity, which is what happened because the Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Schiffs all bought the original stock in 1914 and have owned it ever since. And they've put it into foundations, so it can never be touched. And these foundations are the real government of the United States, Rockefeller Foundation. Nearly all of your major legislation in the United States is prepared by these foundations. And they submit it to Congress, and of course they have enormous staffs and billions of dollars. So they bring the legislation before Congress. And it's impeccable. It's researched and it's phrased and everything is done just right. And so of course the Congress accepts it. And they look around and they say, is anybody objected to any of this? And of course there's total silence. Nobody objects. So it becomes law. That's why you have laws constantly passed by Congress which are actively opposed by 85% of the American people. Almost everything that's done in Washington is opposed by 85% of the American people. So you have government by 15%, government by elites. And they're not even Americans. These are international elitists. They have no allegiance whatsoever to the United States, just like your Canadian legislatures have no allegiance to you. They have no allegiance to Canada. They're part of the international elite. But of course they don't say this publicly, and the press hails them all as great patriots and dedicated people, selfless individuals. They love that word selfless. Imagine, all your legislators are selfless. They never have a selfish bone in their body because they're working for you. They want to give you things. And of course the only purpose they have is to rob you. Not only you, but all 6 billion people in the world, because it's a government of robbery. So you have what you call the new economy in the United States, and probably Canada too. And the new economy is simply people working and creating and producing in spite of everything the robbers can do to them. Everything that's accomplished in this country is accomplished in spite of the foundations, in spite of the bankers. People have to work harder to pay the interest, but they do that. They rise to the challenge. At some point, the people will have to make themselves recognized. And they're doing this through the internet. The big question mark is the internet. And that's why Washington has been making frantic efforts to control the internet.
10 Reasons to Sink the Titanic in 1912. Do you enjoy a good mystery? I have read a lot about the Titanic. I have watched videos about it also. I don't go to the movies, so I did not watch any Titanic movies. I consider the mishap intentional. I know the reasons why the Titanic was sunk. I made a list of 10 things, and I'd like you to try your own luck. Test your own knowledge of the Titanic disaster. This is a test to see how much fluoride is in your water. The first thing that you discover when you start looking into the Titanic is that it wasn't the Titanic that went down. It was the Olympic. So the question should be, why was the Olympic sunk? But I'm going to stick with the Titanic because you would not understand it if I called it what it really was, the Olympic. So what was it about the Olympic that required it to be sunk? It was in an accident with the Hawk. And that accident bent the hull of the ship. In order to repair it, the entire ship would have to be taken apart and the entire hull replaced. Enormously expensive. The White Star Line was in financial trouble. And so J.P. Morgan cooked up this plan to sink it, and the Rothschilds were involved. The Olympic was not insurable. And so it could not be put in use to generate revenue, so it had to be sunk. So J.P. Morgan announced the maiden flight of the Titanic. The two ships were in dry dock for 2 weeks or so, where they switched everything and made one ship look like the other. And the propeller was changed, by the way. So if you want to prove that the sunken ship was the Titanic, all you have to do is switch the propellers and it's the Titanic. It's not the Olympic. They found evidence that it was the Olympic, and that was covered up. So we have this big celebration, the launching of the Titanic. It's on its maiden voyage to the U.S., going from Liverpool, I think, or not Liverpool, it was another port, to New York City. I read that the rescue ship, the Californian, was carrying wool sweaters. That was not true. It was a cotton ship. It was supposed to rescue the passengers, but the distress signal was ignored. They were only 6 miles away in the Californian. They were naming ships after states, and this one was named the Californian. The White Star Line was almost bankrupt at the time. They had a damaged ship that was uninsurable, could not generate revenue, and they were going down the toilet. White Star Line was sinking, so they sunk the Olympic and told the world it was the Titanic. But if it was the sister ship, there were 3 of them, the sister ship would be the damaged Olympic, and this ship was insurable after the sinking of the Titanic, and that proves that it was the Titanic. It was insurable, and it remained in service until World War II, I believe. I used to know more, but I forgot most of what I knew. I found a website that has all the testimony of all the people that were on the Titanic and survived. That is a very interesting page. Dozens and dozens and dozens of testimonies. So if they sink the ship, they can collect the insurance money and be afloat again. The Rothschilds own part or most of the White Star Line. How do I know that? Because J.P. Morgan was a front for them. He only owned 19% of the companies. The Rothschilds did not want a high profile. They let him take the high profile. The same thing goes on today. The super rich are not going to take the high profile. They're going to let some smaller guy get all the fame and notoriety, and his name is Elon Musk. Don't be fooled by the things he says. Watch what he does. So we've got a ship in the water that's not insurable, and we make it look like the Titanic in dry dock, we have to cut portholes in order to make them match. And the insurance company that paid was involved in the scam. And I think the Rothschilds called on them to do him a favor. So they put the ships in dry dock, switched the propellers, and the Olympic became the Titanic. The plan was to sink the ship without killing anybody. And that would be achieved by number 10. The Californian would be nearby to save people. Maybe the captain of the ship was unaware of it because he went to bed in a manner that would indicate that he was not involved, that this was planned without telling him anything. And so when the distress signal was given that they were in trouble, they thought it was just celebration. That's what I read. But I also read that he went to bed at the normal time, and there was nothing suspicious about his behavior. The Carpathian was almost 10 times farther away, and by the time they got there, they saved some people in lifeboats, but they were already in lifeboats. It was dangerous conditions. They traveled 58 miles to come to the rescue of the Titanic. Can you think of any other reason for sinking the Olympic? It was a good way to get rid of the opponents of the Federal Reserve Act. So J.P. Morgan invited them, then he canceled at the last minute, claimed he was ill, but he was with his mistress. I think it was in France. How do you get from France to Southampton? I looked up the port using Perplexity AI, and it said the Titanic departed from Southampton, England on April 10, 1912, her maiden voyage to New York City. The ship made additional stops at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown, now Cobh, C-O-B-H, in Ireland, to pick up passengers, crew, and supplies before heading to New York. Well, I didn't know that until just now. So that begs the question, which city in France was J.P. Morgan at when he was caught with his mistress? Did he get off the ship? He boarded the ship, shook hands with all the people he was killing. I think there was Guggenheim and John Jacob Astor on that ship. There were about 50 people that were of notoriety. Anyway, each time I think through this, I come up with more questions to research. I'm sick of researching the Titanic. I've read enough about it to realize that it was an insurance scam. All the supporting reasons are here. The Olympic was damaged. It was sinking the company, and sinking it was the only way out. It was a good way to get rid of opponents of the Federal Reserve. The ship was not insurable, could not produce revenue. White Star Line was in financial trouble. All of these things are circumstantial evidence that fits perfectly like a jigsaw puzzle into what I'm surmising here. And look how many years have passed. 112 years have passed, and we're still fed propaganda lies. The cost of the repair of this damaged ship was beyond realistic and reasonable. The whole ship would have to be taken apart and put back together with a new hull. It was so easy to put them both in dry dock. There were 3 ships. The third one, I think, was called Britannica or something. Put the 2 ships, Olympic and Titanic, in dry dock, switch the propellers, because there was actual damage to the Olympic propeller. They had to remove it. Putting the Titanic propeller on the Olympic and calling it the Titanic would be an easy way to sink the ship without being noticed. And what do they look for at this time? When they go down to visit the Titanic, what do they film? They film the propeller with a number 401, and that is the Titanic. What a surprise. The damaged ship has the nameplate changed. The propeller is sought because they wanted that number, and they already knew that 401 was what they would find. They found 401, and they concluded that it was, in fact, the Titanic, which is a total fabrication. Let me tell you another big story. 19 Arabs with box cutters brought down 3 World Trade Center buildings in controlled demolitions in 2001. The lies just never stop. I read enough to know that the Rothschilds called on the insurer and said, I need to have a favor, I'll give you a lot of money. And the person that was heading up the insurance company accepted the bribe. That's my conjecture. He accepted the bribe, and the payoff was a shoo-in. Did they intend on killing people? Yes. Did they intend on killing common passengers? No. But when the ship was wrecked by the iceberg, they locked steerage passengers, common people, in their quarters because there weren't enough lifeboats. They intended for the men, and I'm talking particularly about Guggenheim and John Jacob Astor, they wanted these 2 guys dead, and a few others. All the movies that have been made about the Titanic, they never told the truth about anything. They made it a love story. I believe they planned to have the Californian there to rescue the captain of the ship and some others, but he shot himself when he realized that the California was not going to rescue anybody. He tried to kill himself earlier in the night, and somebody took the gun out of his hand, but what I read is that he succeeded later and killed himself and went down with the ship. Now, what do you actually believe about the sinking of the Titanic? What do you know and what do you believe? Because people who want to argue don't have any facts. They're full of dogma. It's belief without proof. And that's how the common person thinks. When they vote for candidates, they're more likely to vote for someone they know 1 or 2 things about. They're not going to dig in and find out that he's really deep state. They're not going to look at his track record after having been elected the president, supposedly. I think he was installed. All presidents are appointed. None of them are elected. You don't even get a chance to run unless you're going to be loyal to the bankers. So people make their decision based on one piece of information, and it's usually a lie. Trump is not a billionaire, after all. He has his name on buildings that he can't afford. He can't make $300 million a year mortgage payments. His casinos don't generate enough revenue. Why do we bother investigating a tragedy that's 112 years old? My answer is that it's important to know what was done. It's our way of staying one step ahead of them, knowing what they did, what they're capable of, in order to understand what they would do today. The human nature doesn't die. The evil that was there remains there generation after generation. What government will always do is pile up money and steal it. The sinking of the Titanic was a theft of an enormous amount of money, which may seem like pennies today because the inflation is so high that 98% of the US dollar is gone. There's no purchasing power left. It's down to about 2% of what it was in 1912, 1913. The Titanic was an extraction of wealth in order to save a Rothschild company, White Star Line. The people who front for the Rothschilds are people like J.P. Morgan, and those that head up the Federal Reserve today. They keep changing the face of the Fed, our central bank, in order to make people forget about the deeds of the last chairman. But they have a bad guy taking all the attention. They typically are people who love attention and want the limelight on them. And then they replace this guy or woman and put in a new one and start their scam all over again. Look into any well-known event like the JFK assassination and get all the pieces of the puzzle. Throw out the ones that you find don't fit. Put the pieces of the puzzle together so you have an understanding of what happened in 1963. I am sure that Oswald worked for the CIA. I'm sure he was set up to take the blame. Witnesses placed him in the cafeteria having a Coke, and I think they are correct. I think the central bank ordered the hit, and they hired the mob to do it. I like puzzles, and each one of these events is a puzzle to put together. Not only to test your reasoning skill, but to test the amount of fluoride in your drinking water. Because if you can't reason, it might be the fluoride. Thanks for watching.
The ship that never sank. Was the Titanic swapped with its sister ship, the Olympic, as part of an insurance scam? It is an historical irony that the most famous ship to ever sail was famous because it sank, but that was the case with the RMS Titanic. Then the world's largest and most luxurious cruise liner. It hit an iceberg on its maiden voyage early on the morning of the April 15, 1912. Within 3 hours, it had sunk to the bottom of the ocean, killing 1,500 of the ship's 2,224 passengers and crew. Titanic was one of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners built at the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, the other 2 being the RMS Britannic and the RMS Olympic. The Olympic was launched a year before the Titanic, but seemed to share its more famous sister ship's poor luck. Within months of its launch in 1911, it had had 2 serious collisions, the second with Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke off the coast of the Isle of Wight, causing serious structural damage to the Olympic's keel and steel beams. Some authors have suggested that the damage to the Olympic was more serious than admitted. In fact, it was virtually a write-off. Repairs would be ruinously expensive, running into millions of pounds. The already troubled White Star Line was facing a potential financial disaster. Could White Star and its owner J.P. Morgan have devised an audacious insurance scam to try and salvage their investment in the troubled Olympic line? The Olympic, the theory goes, would be swapped with the Titanic and sunk in a staged accident. The Titanic, now disguised as the Olympic, would then carry on in service. The 2 ships were essentially identical save for minor differences and were moored side by side in dry dock. The swap would entail nothing more elaborate than swapping a few nameplates and plaques. Although not a new theory, Robin Gardner popularized the insurance swap theory in his 1998 book, Titanic, The Ship That Never Sank. Could it really have been the Olympic that sank in the Titanic's place? Proponents of the swap theory have pointed out disparities in the number of portholes on the ships. The Olympic had 16 and the Titanic had 14. Photographs taken of the Titanic in dry dock show it with 14 portholes. But by the time of its doomed maiden voyage, it now had 16, just like the Olympic. Was this evidence that the ships had been swapped, or just that they had added 2 extra portholes as part of aesthetic changes to the Titanic? Other evidence supports the switch. The windows on the Olympic were somewhat unevenly spaced, but more evenly spaced on the Titanic. Again, by the time of its maiden voyage, the Titanic had acquired unevenly spaced windows like the Olympic. The damage to the Olympic after its collision with the Hawke lent it a noticeable and permanent 2 degrees list to port. The undamaged Titanic had no such list. However, one second-class passenger who survived the sinking, Lawrence Beasley, later reported the Titanic did, in fact, list to port, stating the Titanic listed to port. It was plain she did so, for the skyline and sea on the port side were visible most of the time and on the starboard only sky. Beasley, a science teacher, was considered a reliable observer and would later write one of the first books about the Titanic disaster. Rumors amongst crew. There was a nationwide coal strike during the launch of the Titanic, leading to thousands of firemen, boiler stokers, and greasers short of work. Yet despite this, the Titanic struggled to find crew, with many men refusing to work on the ship at any price. Rumors were circulating amongst the workers at Harland and Wolff that the ships had been swapped as part of an insurance scam, and Titanic was to be sunk. Did foreknowledge of the sinking of the Titanic frighten men off from wanting to work on the ship? Despite the immense fanfare and hype that surrounded the Titanic launch, it was only just over half full when it left Southampton on its doomed voyage. Did White Star want to minimize the number of passengers because it intended to scuttle the ship? Or had the rumors of the insurance scam spread outside of the shipyards? Several last-minute cancellations from high-profile passengers certainly suggest some kind of foreknowledge. Many of the richest and most prestigious names in early 20th century society were booked onto the Titanic. J.P. Morgan, the international financier who owned the White Star's parent company, was due to travel on the Titanic but canceled his trip a few days before the departure, claiming illness. A New York Times reporter discovered this to be a lie. Morgan was actually seen perfectly well with his mistress in France on the very day Titanic sunk. Industrialist Henry Clay Frick and his wife, banker Horace J. Harding and billionaire George Washington Vanderbilt, all connected to Morgan, were amongst several other prominent figures who canceled at the last minute. The SS Californian, also owned by J.P. Morgan, was a large passenger ship that was ultimately blamed for the loss of life on the Titanic. It behaved somewhat oddly around the time of the Titanic's voyage. Carrying no passengers, it steamed into the middle of the Atlantic, stopped, and waited. Its only cargo was 3,000 woolen blankets and jumpers. What was the purpose behind this curious maneuver? Was the Californian intended to rescue the Titanic's passengers after its deliberate sinking? Edith Russell, a survivor of the sinking, was adamant that Titanic officers assured her the Californian was on its way. Author Robin Gardiner suggests serious navigation errors led to the Californian stopping in the wrong area, some 12 miles away from the Titanic. With the Californian unable to complete its rescue mission, the Titanic was doomed, and some 1,500 passengers and crew perished in one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history. The wreck of the Titanic was discovered by Robert Ballard in 1985. Some evidence from the wreck supports the switch theory. The stamp 401, the ID number used for the Titanic at Harland and Wolff, can be seen on the Titanic's propeller. However, some authors have suggested that the Titanic propeller was fitted to the Olympic during its repair following the collision with the Hawk. If true, this would be strong evidence that the vessel on the ocean floor was really the Olympic. What appear to be the letters M and P can also be seen on the side of the wreck. Could that be the remains of the ship's original etched nameplate, Olympic, covered over with the Titanic's as part of the scam? The wreck appears to show some evidence of the gray paint used as an undercoat on the Olympic. The Titanic used black paint for its undercoat. Lack of media scrutiny. Insurance scams and maritime fraud were common at the time of the Titanic sinking. Whilst it seems unlikely such a scam could be pulled off today, the lack of media coverage in 1912 makes it more credible. Only one film survives of the Titanic, and the photo record is also scant. With the two ships extremely similar, it is argued that only the most eagle-eyed would ever have spotted the swap. Evidence against the wreck. Whilst the wreck of the Titanic found in 1985 provided some evidence in favor of the swap theory, more emerged that suggest the ship found at the bottom of the Atlantic really was the Titanic. The Titanic's identification number, 401, is stamped in multiple places on the wreck and on furniture and other artifacts found by salvagers. Could the swap really have been so elaborate to include swapping furniture and decor between the two ships? Titanic scholars and historians say the proponents of the insurance swap theory have overstated how similar the two ships were. Whilst superficially alike, there were several important structural differences, as well as aesthetic changes made to Titanic to distinguish it from its sister. The first Class A deck on Titanic was enclosed in a glass screen but was open on the Olympic. Titanic's wheelhouse was flat at the front and the Olympic's curved. Olympic's B deck had a first-class promenade, whereas Titanic had private verandas and suites. Indeed, many passengers were booked into the suites, an impossibility if the ship was really the Olympic. Many skeptics of the insurance swap theory have pointed out that even if an insurance scam made financial sense to the White Star Line, The loss of reputation they would suffer if one of their vessels sunk would be devastating. Losing the Titanic on its maiden voyage would be a publicity disaster for White Star and lead to a loss of confidence in the company amongst passengers. The intention behind the Olympic-class liners was to attract rich first-class passengers and offer them the finest in luxury and opulence. With image paramount, a sinking would prove to be a catastrophe for the company. Deliberately sinking a ship, the Titanic was infamously described as unsinkable. Whilst this proved to be incorrect, only a freak set of circumstances managed to sink it. Could plotters really have engineered something so complex as the sinking of the world's largest vessel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? With so many variables and so many things that could go wrong, how could they be sure they would succeed? If their plan was discovered, the consequences would have been dire. The perpetrators would be blamed for the deaths of 1,500 people, perhaps even charged with their murder. Would the likes of Whiteline and J.P. Morgan, a billionaire who could afford any potential losses on the Olympic, really risk the gallows for an insurance scam? The Olympic post-Titanic. The Olympic, or, if the insurance swap theory is true, the Titanic disguised as the Olympic, continued to serve for many years. It acted as troop transport in WW1 and resumed service as a luxury liner in the 20s and 30s before being finally retired in 1935. In all of that time, no evidence that the ship was really the Titanic was ever discovered. Even when it was dismantled in 1936, there was no indication that the ship was anything other than the Olympic.